And now on to introducing today's speaker. Michael Marsman is a licensed clinical social worker and a certified Jungian analyst in private practice in Berkeley, California, and is a member of the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association in New York and the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco, where he serves on the Board of Governors. His research focuses on Hindu mythology and gender and sexuality. Among his published works are Bringing Dharma to Earth, the Sabarimalai. I had that worked out before, but now I don't have that cheat sheet in front of me. Here it is, Sabarimalai, a pilgrimage, and the Ayyappan myth in Spring Journal, Transgenderism and Transformation, an attempt at a Jungian understanding, and Kali in praise of the goddess and psychological perspectives. Michael teaches analysts in training nationally and internationally and presents on diverse topics such as Hindu mythology, analytic ethics, transgenderism, archetypes and the collective unconscious, amplification, mythology, and dream analysis. He also provides supervision and consultation in the US and abroad. Take it away, Michael.
Judy, thank you so much, and I'm sorry you're still feeling sick. Hello, everybody. It's nice. I've been scrolling through the attendees, and I've seen people that I've been seeing for some years, and also some of my colleagues at my San Francisco analytic home. So it's nice to see everybody again. I was just laughing. I would love to see how the transcription is going to, how the transcribing process is going to present some of these Hindu terms.
Now, they can't even get Jung spelled correctly, so.
No, exactly. So that could be a comedy in itself. So today we are not going to get through everything. And so let's just be okay with that, because that's how psychic process is, and that's sort of the a kind of attitude to adapt if you're going to be studying Hinduism. And so before we started, there is a Hindu, well, as we start, there's a Hindu god, Ganesha, which is an elephant-headed god that is worshipped throughout India and also in the States. You perhaps have seen images of him. And I am going to show you a picture right here. This is an image of Ganesha. Ganesha is it's actually a kind of human form because it's a god, but a human with an elephant head. And we'll start with a prayer to Ganesha because Ganesha is the remover of obstacles, but in good Jungian fashion, also puts obstacles in one's place so that one can then overcome them. And any venture, whether it's a store or a new business or a class, really starts in paying homage to Ganesha. So I will say a Sanskrit prayer to Ganesha, and then I will translate it. Om Shreem Hreem Kleem Klom Gun Ganapate Vara Varadha Savajanamaye Vasamanya Swaha Ekadanta Vidmahe Vakrutunde Dhimhai Tano Danti Prachodayat Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. We offer salutations to Lord Ganesha, the one with a single tusk. We meditate on him who has a curved trunk. May he guide us. O the giver of boons, the bestower of blessings, present in all beings, residing everywhere, we offer you our devotion. Om, peace, peace, peace. So we'll start that way. Now, I apologize ahead of time. because my pronunciation is going to be off. And part of it is that sometimes in presenting, I get a little nervous, and so I may just fumble words. So if anybody speaks Hindi or Sanskrit, please, or if there are any Indians or Hindus here in the audience, please forgive me. And also, I'm not so much a Hindu expert, other than my partner is Hindu and I'm part of this big Indian family, and they're all very religious. And so I've been going to temples and, Hindu temples, and going to India and reading about Hinduism for years, for a couple of decades, actually. And while I'm not an expert in Hinduism, as a Jungian analyst, I specialize in images, and in being able to approach images with a particular lens, and being able to then translate images into both psychological language and then lived life experience. And in some way, that's what we as analysts do. In image, I mean image in the broadest sense. So, we all have dreams, there are dream images, but when let's say a patient comes to me in sessions for analysis, what they say, I hear that as an image, or anything that happens in session, like if somebody starts coughing or sneezing or yawning, that's an image. If somebody comes in and tells me a story, oh, I was on my way to session, but there was so much traffic today, I don't know why, and it almost kept me from getting here. I hear that as an image. In that case, if somebody said there was so much traffic, it almost kept me from getting here, I would translate that and hear it as somebody saying that they kind of got caught up in collective movement. And they're getting caught up in a collective movement, almost got in the way of their tending to their own individual process. So if somebody said, I was walking here and I was fighting crowds to get into the session, I got so angry, I'd hear that as somebody who tends to have difficulty, let's say, going with the flow, or is kind of at odds with kind of collective movement, and maybe somewhat combative or something. So that's what I mean by hearing everything as an image. And so when I hear any kind of Hindu story or Christian story or mythology, what I do is I listen to it symbolically. In other words, I hear it as an image, as something having to do with our own inner psychological process. And then I translate that into what it looks like psychologically, and what it looks like in terms of lived experience. And I say that because, and if some of you are familiar with Jungian terminology, we talk about the shadow, for example, and the shadow is an aspect of it's part of our personality that we're generally not aware of. Oftentimes, it's petty aspects of ourselves that maybe other people can see we can't. So it could be, let's say, anger or cheapness or something. And so I think that if you see an image, you tell a religious story, and there's this monster in the story, and you could say, well, that monster represents the shadow. That's not enough. It's what does a monster look like in somebody's life? Is a monster the thing that really comes over you and when you're anxious and you become monstrous? Is it, sometimes you may have a dream where there's an intruder that would represent the shadow. Would that be in your lived life something gnawing at you and you get very anxious about it because you really don't want to know what it is, and yet it keeps pressing on you? That's what an image of an intruder would look like. So from a Jungian perspective, it's important to be able to look at any story or any utterance or any sort of presentation, somebody all of a sudden having to go to the bathroom, and be able to kind of interpret that into what that means and into language that's accessible to somebody. So today, a goal is to really be able to uh, have like an introductory lesson. And for those of you who are experienced in this will just be another form of that. To be able to learn a systematic lesson, a systematic method of understanding symbolic material and applying it to anything. Now, just to kind of recap, a symbol is something that's the best expression of something unfathomable, something that we don't really understand. So, for example, in Hinduism, there's the god Shiva. And Shiva is often depicted in a form of a lingam, what looks like an erect phallus. Um, a Freudian would say, oh, that represents a penis. That's not really a symbol. A symbol is something that is attempting to approach something. And again, we can't really plumb the depths of it. So let me just show you. I think I have one here for a second. Okay. So this is an image of Shiva, this part. And so from a Jungian perspective, we look at the lingam and say, well, it has something to do with potency, and it has something to do with creativity. It's spermatic, it's creative, it's assertive, it's a sense of agency and power. And we could keep going on forever. And so that's what I mean by a symbol, and I use the term image and symbol interchangeably. This Jungians do something called amplification, and you may be familiar with that. It's when let's say somebody has a dream, or somebody presents a particular image, we look to see, okay, where does this story that somebody's telling us show up in culture? And oftentimes, where does it show up in culture? Where does it show up in religion? Where does it show up in mythology? Because movies, TV shows, religion, every type of mythology is really an attempt to use the external to explain inner psychic processes. So we call that projection. So as an analyst, I can't make any metaphysical claim as to the existence of God, let's say. God is unknowable, and yet we see people in all cultures seem to have some kind of system for recognizing this something, or the transcendent, in that which has power over us and that which can transform us, and that which gives rise to the world in which we live, we call that God, let's say. So there are certain motifs that are typical for various religions, and we see the same themes over and over and over and over again. So what Jungian does is we can look to outside of our own experience to see where our experience is reflected in various cultures. And by that, I mean not just in Hindu mythology or Greek mythology or Christianity or Judaism, but also in film, in the current news. These things all reflect in a kind of projections of inner psychic experience. So Marie-Louise von Franz, a Jungian analyst, talked about the myth-making function of the human psyche. And she said in studying the psyche that you cannot study plants without studying the soil on which they grow. If you're a good gardener, you have knowledge of the soil as well as of the plants. And in mythology, we are the soil of the motifs. So we study mythology in order to understand ourselves. It helps us understand the structure of the psyche in its patterns. We also use it to help us, analysts in sessions, to help kind of give an understanding and interpretation of dreams, let's say. Also, amplification through mythology and other motifs helps patients, in all of us, have a sense of meaning in life. It helps us not feel alone in the world and not feel alone in our experience. And it helps to understand oneself in context. It's also a Jungian way of diagnosing people and understanding prognosis. In our culture, in the mental health field, in some ways, I would say Jungian analysis is a different profession than psychotherapy. And I'll tell you why in a little bit. But it's as I said, it's a way we diagnose people. You know, I don't know if many of you have heard or most of you have heard of the DSM. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders. So in it are things like depression, generalized anxiety disorder, major depression, schizophrenia. The way the psychological and psychiatric establishment diagnoses is via symptoms. So if you have symptoms, let's say you feel hopeless and you're sad most of the time, and you have low energy, we might call that depression. If you're fearful and jumpy and always worried, we might call that anxiety. But that doesn't speak to what gives rise to these symptoms in the first place. So when we talk about, let's say, something like narcissism, you know, people think narcissism is somebody who's really only focused on themselves. That's not actually what narcissism is. To understand what narcissism is, you have to look at the myth of Narcissus. And you have to include Echo in that. Echo was a nymph that was in love with Narcissus. And you have to understand the curse that was placed upon Echo and the curse that was placed upon Narcissus in order to really understand the dynamics of narcissism. So you could say that somebody has a narcissism complex, for example, where they kind of live out they live out that myth in their everyday lives. And so there's Dionysus. Dionysus was involved in there are different stories involving the Greek god Dionysus. Well, you can look at those stories and look at somebody's psyche and see if unconsciously they're kind of going through some similar patterns. Now, these various patterns may manifest as anxiety or may manifest as depression, but the symptoms to me are less important than what's going on underneath them. Also, as an analyst, what happens in amplification is it helps me as an analyst to not be stuck in my own associations to an image. I don't get to decide what an image is. But as like let's say there's an image of shark. I don't get to say, well, but this shark was beautiful, this shark was friendly. That's not the nature of what a shark is. So understanding how a shark, what a shark is biologically, understanding maybe where sharks show up in various mythologies helps us orient ourselves to an image. All right, so I just wanted to talk about that for a minute. See if there's anything else. The other thing about images that Marie-Louise von Franz talks about is she issues us a warning, and she said that the interpretation of the dream is never as good as the dream itself. So the image, the mythological story, that is the best description or the best illustration of what's going on in somebody's psyche. And we have to resort to language, which is more abstract, in order to assimilate it into consciousness. But when images are numinous, and by numinous, I mean when they have a lot of power, when they really grab you, relating to an image, connecting to it, meditating on it, that itself can give you an experience and that can create some change. So I next want to talk about, I hope this is clear. I know I'm going through a lot of stuff. So next I'll talk about why I was drawn to Hinduism and why I think Hinduism is actually quite helpful from a Jungian perspective. I find that Hinduism really presents an apt and nuanced way of understanding psychological material. It employs shape-shifting and tricksterism as part of Leela. And Leela is Sanskrit for divine play. And it underscores the way in which mythology captures processes that are beyond conventional understandings of rationality and morality, without some of the prejudices inherent in Western mythology. And you'll see this play out. Hinduism in its myth doesn't really adhere to a kind of mythology and morality and ethics the way we like things to be here in the West and even in our religion. I find the imagery in Hinduism. So, a good example of the kind of tricksterism, shapeshifting would be somebody like Ganesha, right? Elephant head, human body. There's another a figure we're going to encounter named Mohini, and don't worry about getting these names. Mohini is this god, one of the three Hindu trilogy, one of the gods, Vishnu, and it's Vishnu in female form, who's really very sexy and beautiful and seductive. The imagery in Hinduism is able to symbolize at once the changeable and multifaceted nature of psychic process. Its imagery, which is theriomorphic, meaning animals as animal kind of human or animal god combination like Ganesha, and anthropomorphic images depict both instinct, so our instinctual bodily driven aspect at the same time as the intellectual and reflective aspect. Also in Hinduism, transformation is not a one-shot deal. You don't get to the end of the myth and then that's it. The myths depict processes that are continuing to be ongoing. Sorry, I see I'm striped. Okay, that's better. So the myths depict processes that are able to be ongoing and continuing to develop, and they take different twists and turns, and they have multiple endpoints. The other thing that's fascinating, which I love about Hinduism, is that there are various versions of the myth, various versions of the stories, and many of them contradict each other. And the fact that they contradict each other and exist side by side and they're not reconcilable don't undermine their validity. So you can have the same story at the beginning with the same gods, and one ends this way and one ends the other way, and you don't have to choose which you're going to hold to. So we don't really have that concept. And again, the way the myths and the stories present themselves is reflective of Hindu psyche. So we talk about we tend in our culture to be either or oriented and also perfection oriented. And Hinduism, I find, allows for the both this and that, rather than this or that. And it also sorry, I just forgot what I was going to say. So you can ask, how does this serve our understanding of the psyche? And it's again that perfection versus wholeness. I think this is, Jung in the Red Book talked about perfection versus wholeness. And in our culture, we're oriented towards perfection. We always imagine we're moving forward. Youth tends to be valued and the perfect body. How can we be the most beautiful? We want to have a better and better job. And if we have problems in life, we assume that something's wrong. We look for things to be clean and understandable. Conflicts between people have to be resolved. If they're not, there's a problem. If there are irreconcilable differences in a marriage, you get divorced, right? We're really oriented towards perfection. Jung talked about wholeness versus perfection. And wholeness includes the messy, it includes the error, it includes incapacity, which we have to recognize in ourselves. It includes, falling apart, being confused, not understanding things. It includes dirt and corruption and all this stuff. And it also includes perfection. And so we strive for wholeness in Jungian process. The individuation process is really about experiencing our wholeness or moving towards that rather than focusing on perfection. And I think in some ways, Hinduism is also oriented towards perfection, but it also includes wholeness. I think more so than we do in the West. For example, gods as gods as both man and animal. Gods can be both good, but also kind of corrupt and error prone and vengeful and make mistakes. And the demons themselves can be worshipful and have a kind of pure aspect to them. So it's kind of not as split as things are here in the West. So for example, we have in Christianity, Jesus, which represents perfection, and Satan, which represents the evil, destructive kind of force of entropy. And in Hinduism, the gods have a little bit of the darkness in them, and the demons have some of the goodness in them. And so the thing Hinduism can show us that psychic material can go in different ways. So it's good for practicing analysts because it can offer us the reminder not to get too fixed an idea in how you expect things to go. That things can always take different twists and turns. Hinduism is a big tent religion where little is excluded. So, for example, Jesus would just be considered to be another god. There are 333 million gods in Hinduism, as it said, yet all are expressions of the ultimate, that which is beyond qualities, the kind of ineffable ultimate called Brahman. It's a living religion where gods are continuing to come into being. For example, there was a goddess, Santoshi Mata, who emerged in the mid 1960s, and her popularity surged when a Bollywood film director had a dream of her, and then he made a film in 1975, and the film was a hit all across the country, so people started worshiping her. Hinduism, I find, has abundant diversity and color and humor, and it's very experience near, which means it's good at depicting the complexity of psychic processes in a way that's accessible to our egos. And it's exotic and colorful, and it can be seductive and enticing and erotic and intriguing, and that all pulls us in. And so our psyches do this to us. The erotic, the enticing, the alluring, that which draws us into life that might result in disaster, still may be important for us psychologically. We get pulled into things. The color, the beauty, the fascination, the ugliness draw us in, and we have to respond to these in order to have a full life. So that's some of the reasons why I like Hinduism and think it's so wonderful at depicting psychic process. Also, there are a lot of similarities between Hindu and Jungian conceptions and even aims and our systems correspond in many respects. There are some differences. While Hinduism ultimately focuses on liberation from life, liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth, Jungian uh, uh, Jungian theory tends to focus on how one experiences this life and how one can live fully in this life. So the aim for Jungian is not to ultimately escape life, but to live it fully, while in Hinduism, the aim is ultimately to not have to be reborn again. You could say both focus on a kind of detachment and a kind of even attitude to be liberated from the trials and tribulations and ups and downs of life. I think both are similar in that way. Okay. I did want to talk about a little bit about why I call it Hindu mythology, and to separate mythology, to differentiate mythology from religion. Um, a myth is typically a traditional story, and it typically involves supernatural beings or forces, and it embodies and provides an explanation, etiology, or justification for something, such as an early history of a society, or a religious belief. Um, the religions hold to the metaphysical. And so, as an analyst, or as analysts, we approach it from a mythological rather than religious point of view, so that it doesn't reflect our beliefs in a specific, fixed, or even exclusive set of images and creeds. So again, we don't make any kind of metaphysical claim as to the existence of God out there. What we know is um, that that we as human beings have images of God, that we have experiences of the transcendent, and we can only speak to our experience. And so this is why I talk about mythological. Um, Also, I find that approaching it as a religion carries with it the danger that we think we understand it, and the danger that we can hold, okay, well, this is the answer. And I think that this, from a mythological perspective, this is one way that we describe our experience, and there are as many ways as there are people. For example, when I hear people in session and they tell me the story of their lives, I hear that as a creation myth. I hear it as somebody saying, this is how I came to be who I am. This is how I came to this moment in life. That everything that happened before is what went into creating me. So I hear that as a creation myth. Just a couple of facts about Hinduism. Hinduism is it's the oldest religion in the world, continually practiced. It's the third largest religion with over 1 billion adherents. Hindu is derived from actually, I'm not going to go into that. But Hinduism, well, actually, yeah, it's derived from the word Sindhu, and it's an Indo-Aryan word for Indus, referring to the Indus River. But Hindu isn't what Hindus basically call themselves. Hinduism is like a synthesis of various Indian cultures and traditions with diverse roots and no founder. And it began to develop between 500, the modern Hinduism began to be developed between 500 in 500 BCE and 300 CE, but some tribal religions still exist, which originated as far back as 4000 BC. And it was only in the 18th century that European merchants and colonists began to refer to the followers of the various Indian religions collectively as Hindus. The term Dharma is preferred in India, and traditionalists refer to the religion as Sanatana Dharma, or the ancient and eternal Dharma, or religious truth. So the Vedas are the oldest Hindu written texts, composed between 1500 BCE to 500 BCE, many centered around ritual and sacrifice. A lot of the gods in the current Hindu pantheons were in the Vedas, but they were much more minor. The kind of Hinduism that's practiced today is post-Veda, post something called the Upanishads, and it probably began somewhere from 400 BCE. In most of the religious texts were from 200 this era to around 1000. But why don't I go into the mythology in the story? So the Hindu god Ayyappan, or Ayyappa, and by the way, when I go through this story, I think I'm going to share on screen a cast of characters so that you can refer to it. Is a much beloved South Indian deity. He's a child god, and his worship centers around the temple in Sabarimalai in Kerala. And the deity, Ayyappan's popularity has grown in recent decades, and it's estimated that 10 to 50 million worshipers, almost all men, make the difficult pilgrimage to his temple every year to worship this child god whose name actually means father of father. So even right there in his name is some of the contradiction and paradox. You have this child that's father of father. So the myth begins, and so there's the pilgrimage, and I don't know that all the pilgrims actually are aware of the myth that's the backstory to the pilgrimage. In other words, a lot of worshipers worship the god Ayyappan, but don't necessarily understand how he came to be. As an analyst, as somebody looking at the pilgrimage, I thought, okay, what's the story behind this? What's sort of the antique soul? What underlies this pilgrimage? Because there's a kind of hidden meaning there, and understanding the hidden meaning can help us understand the purpose of the pilgrimage, even if the adherents don't consciously understand it. So there are three major Hindu gods, let's say. Brahma, who is a creation god. He's the one that physically created the universe. He's considered to be the most minor of the three major gods and isn't routinely worshipped as much as Vishnu and Shiva are. And so Vishnu is called the sustainer, and Vishnu sustains and infuses matter with life. And so he's the pervader. He's the life that pervades all. He sustains existence. Shiva typically is seen as the god of destruction, but Shiva both creates and destroys. So these three gods don't have kind of fixed roles. But the myth begins with Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva taking on human form in order to establish Dharma. And Dharma means to Dharma in order to establish Dharma in the world. And Dharma means law, duty, right order. So the three were incarnated in this, we'll say a person named Datta, while the gods' consorts, Lakshmi, Parvati, and Sarasvati, are born as the female form named Leela, which means play or divine play, and Datta and Leela get married. And so in Hinduism, the gods tend to be fixed form, while their consorts are the kind of energy behind them. So Vishnu's consort is Lakshmi. And so Vishnu is the sustainer of life, and Lakshmi is beauty, abundance, wealth, kindness. So you could see while Vishnu sustains life, Lakshmi is that which gives life its richness and its beauty. That's how we experience it. Shiva is the god of destruction, but Shiva is also a yogi. In fact, he's an ascetic. He's the quintessential yogi, the quintessential ascetic who lives on top of a mountain and meditates. So his wife, Parvati, has to do with kindness and relatedness. And she's kind. And it's said that Parvati and Shiva make love for 1,000 years, and then they fight for 1,000 years, and then they make love for another 1,000 years, and the cycle continues. So whose relationship is not like that? Or maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm getting too personal. Sometimes it seems like you fight for 1,000 years and have maybe 100 years of the good stuff, and then you fight for another 1,000 years, and then you have 100 years of the good stuff, and it all seems worth it. But the thing about Parvati is that she's about enduring relatedness. How do you continue to relate? How do you continue to stay in relationship with other people, with your life, with what you're doing in the world? And so that's Parvati. And Sarasvati is kind of a goddess of knowledge and wisdom in the arts. She has a musical instrument called the veena that she plays. And so while Brahma creates life, Sarasvati her name also means voice. She gives voice to life. It's the creative stuff in life, arts, intellect, all the stuff that has to do with creation and has to do with that which is part of a full lived created life that hopefully we lead. So Datta and Leela marry, and eventually Datta decides to move into the third stage in Hindu life, where one retires and moves into the forest to focus on spirituality. So in Hinduism, there are various stages in life. Don't worry about any of the terms I'm using, but brahmachari is the first stage, and that's where one's a celibate student, learning spirituality, but also the stuff of the world. The second stage is the householder, grihastha it's called, where you marry, you raise a family, you have a job. It's all the ego stuff, the stuff. The next two stages are what Jung called the second half of life. You retire, your kids go off to school, or you still work, and you start to wonder, what's the meaning of life? The fourth stage is, and so one sort of retires and starts to focus on spirituality. And in the fourth stage is where one goes into the forest, surrenders everything, gives up all wealth and all possessions, and only focuses on spirituality. So Datta decides to move into the third stage, where he only wants to focus on spirituality. Leela, which means divine play, so that means that there's something in this myth that has to do with the play of the gods. In other words, the psyche is working through something here, through trickery and through playfulness, that is meant to thwart the ego in order to get what it wants. So Leela's worldly desires are not let satiated. And so she pleads with Datta not to leave. Datta chastises her, and he tells Leela that desires of the flesh and of the mundane will only lead to misery. But she's adamant, and she argues with her husband, and she says, I'm your Mahishi. And Mahishi means queen, and that he has a duty to satisfy her womanly desires. Datta becomes angry, and he curses his wife to be born as a Mahishi in her next life, because Mahishi also means female buffalo. So Datta is telling Leela, you're too concerned with sex, you're too concerned with all this sort of worldly stuff, you're sinful and you're not pure enough. We should become aesthetic and focus only on God. In time, Leela is born as a buffalo, as Mahishi, and she's angry with the gods and decides to take revenge, because the gods are focused on purity. And she said, and she's angry with them because in another story, her demon buffalo cousin is killed. But in order to become more powerful, Mahishi goes to the mountains to perform tapas. And tapas is a religious austerity, but it really means heat, but it's also penance, to propitiate the god Brahma, who gives her a boon that she can only die by the hand of a 12-year-old son of Vishnu and Shiva, two male gods. So in other words, here you see that this demon buffalo actually is worshipful in praise to the god, in praise to the god Brahma, the god of creation. And so there's something worshipful in here. And this is typical of demons. And the god Brahma recognizes that she's praying to him and grants her this boon. Again, that she can only die by the hand of a 12-year-old son of Vishnu and Shiva. Right, that seems impossible. But we'll see through the myth that this actually happens. So Mahishi deposes Indra, who's the Lord of heaven and kings of the god, and then wreaks havoc among all the gods. So basically, she conquers. And so the gods say, what are we going to do? And they ask Brahma and Vishnu and Shiva for help. So they in turn make Datta, remember the guy that's focused on purity, into a buffalo in order to lure Mahishi far away to earth. All right, I am going to just share my screen here and put the cast of characters up, because I think this is going to be too confusing. Oops, so give me 1 second. Okay. 1 sec. All right. Can people see the cast of characters? Maybe some people can nod.
No, we're not seeing.
Oh, and the screen share?
No.
All right, right. Oh, I see. What about now?
No,
All right, let me try it again. Oh, all right.
that's it.
Okay, great. This is confusing and it'll get a little bit clearer over time. So anyway, so now Mahishi is wreaking havoc among the gods, and they ask the main gods to help, and so what they want to do is lure Mahishi to Earth, um, and get her away from heaven where the gods live. And so how this happens is that so now we come to the appearance of Vishnu as Mohini, the enchantress, and Vishnu appears in this very sexual, enticing, and alluring female form. And Shiva hears about Vishnu and asks her to show himself in that form. When he does, Shiva is, quote, overpowered by passion and chases and and chases and captures Mohini as his, quote, this is in the religious text, as his semen of unfailing procreative capacity, unquote, is discharged, and then Ayyappan is born from the semen of Shiva, falls on the ground as he holds Mohini, this enchantress. Shiva then tells the child that his purpose is to destroy the demon Mahishi, and he's dropped as an infant onto the banks of the river Pampa in Kerala. There's a king who hunts in the woods and comes across the infant. He has no children, so he's overjoyed and he takes the baby back to the palace and his own wife, his elated queen. The child is given a different name. I'm not going to go into it. Let's just call him Ayyappan. At the time, Ayyappan's brought to the palace, and the queen conceives and gives birth to a son. The two boys, Ayyappan and they grew up together as brothers and friends. And the child, Ayyappan, excels at all his studies and disciplines, and he even restores sight and hearing to his guru's blind son. The king regards Ayyappan as an elder son and decides that he'll succeed him and asks his chief minister to make the arrangements. The chief minister dislikes Ayyappan, and so the chief minister incites the queen's jealousy that her own son will not be king. The two connive to bring about the demise of Ayyappan by the queen's feigning an illness that only can be cured with the milk of a leopardess, knowing that Ayyappan will volunteer to undertake the deadly mission to fetch it. So the boy, now 12, so remember, Mahishi said that she can't be destroyed except by the son of Vishnu and Shiva, who's 12 years old. Well, this boy, Ayyappan, now 12, is the son of Vishnu and Shiva, so trouble is brewing here. The boy, now 12, heads into the forest to perform this task when he encounters Mahishi. There's a difficult battle, but Ayyappan prevails. And Ayyappan dances on the body of Mahishi, and Leela, redeemed from her curse, emerges from the carcass. Leela now prays to Ayyappan to take her as his consort, but he tells her that he's still a brahmachari, a celibate student dedicated to study, and assigns her a place as his Shakti, or his energy, or his consort on his left side. He tells her generously that he will marry her when new devotees stop visiting his temple at Sabarimalai. Leela is now given a different name. So upon the slaying of Mahishi, Shiva asks the king to build a temple to Ayyappan at Sabarimalai. And Ayyappan asked Indra, the king of the gods, to take the form of a tiger, on which he rides back to the palace while leading an army of leopardesses. Witnessing this, the queen is made contrite, and the couple recognize Ayyappan as an incarnation of a god and asks him for mercy and forgiveness. Ayyappan now accepts the king's offer to build a temple for him and shoots an arrow which lands where he wants it to be on Sabari Hill. He specifies that there should be 18 steps leading up to the inner sanctum, and that there should, with the gods, oh no, sorry. And that there should also be a shrine to Leela to his left side and one to his friend, a Muslim companion, to the right. And so the king and accompanied by his repentant wife, they go out and they build a temple, and when they install the idol at the temple, Ayyappan ascends these 18 steps, and then there's a bolt of lightning, and he enters into the idol and disappears. And so I think what I'm going to do in the interest of time, because we need time for questions, I'm going to skip actually some of the details of the pilgrimage and go to how we can start to look at the myth psychologically. So the Hindu god Krishna, many of you have heard of them, through the Hare Krishnas. There's the Hare Krishna movement throughout the world, and they became famous and infamous and known because they would dance and sing in airports and things like that. And so Krishna is a god of love and joy. And Krishna worship is called bhakti, loving devotion. And so there's a Hindu scripture called the Bhagavad Gita. And in it, Lord Krishna speaks to Prince Arjuna, and he says to him, whenever there is a decline in Dharma and a predominance of a Dharma, O Arjuna, then I manifest myself. I appear from time to time for protecting the good, for transforming the wicked, and for establishing Dharma. Thus, God, in the form of Krishna, reveals to the virtuous prince, in the midst of a battle in which he struggles with a duty to kill his own kin, that Dharma, that righteousness has to be fulfilled and that right order established. So, in other words, so in the Bhagavad Gita, there's a Hindu epic called the Mahabharata, and there's the virtuous prince, his corrupt and problematic and destructive cousins take over the kingdom. Ayyappan and his cousins have to battle them. Ayyappan, Arjuna doesn't want to because he has to go kill his cousins, and that's anathema to him. Krishna tells him that that this is your dharma, this is your duty. You have to fulfill what is right for you in this life, even if it goes against all of your moral beliefs, all of what if it goes against your kind of ego position, even if it seems kind of wrong to you, based on a kind of collective expectations, this is what you must do in your life. We all have to discover our dharma. we all have to discover what our duty is, and we have to live according to that. And so Krishna tells Arjuna, this is what you must do in order to establish Dharma, in order to live out your duty. So in analysis, if we see Krishna, if we see the God as an image of the self, we could say the self is activated whenever the psyche reaches a state of disequilibrium and begins a process where order can be reestablished. And this process, when something goes wrong in psychic functioning and there's an imbalance of dharma and adharma. Adharma means not dharma. A in front of anything means not in Sanskrit. And so whenever there's disorder, the self activates a healing process, and the ego is urged. So we're urged to become aware of our destiny and act according to it, even if it goes against the particular collective mores with which it identifies. And so this whole Ayyappan myth, including the pilgrimage, is established in order to bring Dharma to earth. And to earth means to live life into matter, time, and space. So when something is in the heavenly realm, that's something in the psychic realm. It's something in the archetypal realm. It's not something that's been realized. When something is brought to earth, that means it's brought into our lived life experience. So we can say that the process underlying Ayyappan worship has something to do with its purpose has to do with the conscious assimilation of Dharma, of right order. You can think of Dharma as being right order and its embodiment in lived life. Dharma is that which is our destiny. And so this whole Ayyappan myth is all about the processes that our psyche goes through in order to reestablish right order in our lived life experience. And so if we look at the myth and the rituals associated with it, and also the pilgrimage, it really addresses the question of what's the initial condition that initiates the incarnation, and what has to be constellated for this to happen. So in analysis, I would ask the same question to my patients or wonder what brings somebody into analysis. What's the initial situation that brings one into analysis? What's the backstory? What's the mythology? What are the conscious and unconscious assumptions that one lives by? What are the dynamics among inner figures and images? What's the direction that somebody's libido or life energy is flowing? What is the person's conscious relationship to their inner process? What is all that initiates the incarnation of a healing dynamic? What within a patient's psyche will be constellated in order to bring Dharma to earth? I think that earlier when I said that that I think Jungian analysis is really different, almost a different profession than other forms of therapy or what's now called mental health or behavioral health, is the concept of telos. And telos or teleology has to do with purpose and where something is moving. So most psychotherapies are oriented towards symptom reduction. And the theory is that if you go back if you go back into history, you can understand how something came to be. and that through that understanding and in kind of recognition of how that's still playing out, there'll be healing. And so it's pathologically oriented, that something has gone wrong, and that that the symptom is an evidence of pathology, or that somebody is engaged in kind of a pathological complex in their life, and that has to be cured. And once that's cured and the complex is no longer there, then that's fine. A Jungian doesn't ask so much where something came from as what's its purpose, where's its heading. So we look at symptoms as being meaningful and not something to be gotten rid of. That symptoms help point us to the meaning of something, and that any kind of psychic disorder is the psyche's way of trying to enlarge itself, of trying to grow. That there's something that we're trying to live. I'm going to stop screen sharing for a second. So, for example, if you look at alcoholism, with alcoholism, there's the idea that if you can limit a person's drinking, and if you can get them to stop drinking, that's the desired result. And so that the problem in alcoholism is the drinking. From a Jungian perspective, alcoholism has to do with a confusion for spirit, for the spirit in the bottle with a true spirit. And so in alcoholism, the psyche is actually going for something healthy. The psyche, an alcoholic generally needs to have a more spirited life. Oftentimes, alcoholics drink because it allows them to be more themselves, or it allows them to be themselves. Maybe it lowers inhibitions. Or sometimes people drink not to feel things because they're not able to have a full experience of themselves that includes both the kind of joyful and easy emotion as well as the difficult one. So if you just get rid of the alcohol and have the alcoholic stops drinking, then you can have somebody that may be sober, but still may be miserable in life. But if you recognize that the alcoholism is pointing to a more spirited life, and for somebody to have a larger life imbued with spirit, imbued with joy, and they need to live in an expanded way, once they're able to focus on that and have some kind of spiritual transformation, the need for alcohol can disappear. So you could say, in a sense, that somebody who's alcoholic, that there's both a blessing and a curse in it. The curse is that sometimes if they're not able to orient themselves to that transformation, of course, they can die from the alcohol. But sometimes, and somebody needs to oftentimes hit bottom in order to make that transfer, in order to surrender to kind of a process. That the alcoholism can lead them to an experience of the self. Same thing with anxiety or depression. Anxiety from a Jungian standpoint is tends to be a fear of something that's trying to make itself known to consciousness that we want to keep out. And so it may be that there's something that could actually give us an experience of an enlarged life, but we're afraid of it. And so we develop anxiety. So if your answer is cognitive behavioral therapy or anti-anxiety medication, you never actually get what is trying to make itself known, and you never get that enlargement of life. So this is what's meant by telos. So whenever there's a symptom, we can say, okay, or some kind of complex, we could say, okay, what is this for? Where is this heading? And so with this myth, you could say there's something about this split between Leela and Datta, between both this sort of spiritual aspect and this desire to be lived and embodied that's split. They're too far apart. And so how do you bring them together? Jungian um, or process psychic growth from a Jungian perspective has to do with how do you hold opposites together? Love and hate, freedom and constriction, a desire and joy and discipline or something. How do you hold them together, the tensions of both, in a way that out of the holding something new arises? So, for example, we tend to be in relationships with people who are in many ways different than us. And in relationship, the purpose of relationship, the purpose of marriage from a psychological standpoint is to develop what's undeveloped in us and to expand who we are. And the person who we're in a relationship with tends to represent what's undeveloped in us. It's sort of like we're left-handed, and when we end up in a relationship, we find somebody that's right-handed, and we need to develop our own right hands to develop a kind of ambidexterism in order to kind of get on in life. When we're single, you can get by with just left-handedness, say. And so when you can hold opposites together, something new can develop. When you can both recognize that you love aspects of somebody and you also really hate aspects of them, they drive you crazy, and you stay in relationship and you hold both, even though it's agonizing, oftentimes you kind of outgrow the problem. You learn a kind of acceptance and something new can develop. And so Jung said that he described it beautifully. There's a book that he wrote called Mysterium Conjunctionis, the mysterious conjunction, that has to do with this process, and it's about alchemy. The alchemists knew this. And he said that the feminine, and by the feminine, I don't mean female, I mean the symbolic feminine. We all have femininity and masculinity in us. That the feminine has as its goal union, and the masculine has as its goal discrimination, which means sort of separateness. That there's an inherent conflict between union, and union is everything together, right? No differentiation. And discrimination is having everything be separate. So there's this inherent conflict between discrimination and union. And that's the problem of unconscious and conscious coming together, of our masculine and feminine sides, of relationships coming together. That's the major issue of life. And we see this embodied in Datta and Leela, where Datta, through her desire for sexuality, holds the union, right? She wants to come together. One way of looking at sex is as a kind of merging, as two becoming one. Datta, focusing on spiritual pursuits, is focusing on the discrimination, because spirituality is really about one's individual experience. He said, let's not focus on union. We have to worship God. It's an internal process. So this whole imbalance is because the spiritual, represented in Datta, in the embodied, the union, represented in Leela, are too far apart. And you notice through the whole mythological process that I won't really be able to get to sort of describe how to interpret each aspect of it. But the whole thing is really about how the two come together. And it's through the play of instinct, it's through these battles. See, with Leela, she was only overly instinctual. She needed more spirituality. And so imagistically, animals tend to represent instinct. And in India, buffaloes are quite aggressive. So Leela was too instinctual. She was animalistically instinctual. And she needed to have some infused with some spirituality, some discrimination. And Datta was too spiritual. He needed to come to earth. So he was, in the godly realm, that wasn't enough. And he was the child. He needed to come to earth. He needed to be born, and he needed to do battle with Mahishi. So he and the instinctual came hand to horns. The instinctual and the embodied, the spiritual came together, and something new has emerged. So Ayyappan, when he came riding out on the tiger, a tiger is instinct. So there you see the proper relationship between the spiritual and the instinctual. Ayyappan was riding the tiger, and with Leela by his side, the two came together again. And so there's so much more to this. So we ask in the beginning, what's the teleological, what's the purpose of this initial break? Well, there was this split in the heavenly realm. That means there was sort of in the unconscious realm, it would be somebody where the spiritual and instinctual is split. And this whole process has to be brought to earth. There has to be like inner battles, struggling with something, making mistakes, living out the instinctual maybe in ways that a conventional and polite society would frown on, to come to this point where there can be a kind of rejoining. I wonder if I should stop there. Let me ask Judy, should I stop there now and ask questions, or should I go on a little bit?
It's so hard to know.
No.
I think a little bit more might be okay.
Okay.
5-10 minutes, and then go to the Q&A.
Okay.
Let's try that,
Yeah.
if that works for you.
Yeah, that's fine. Sure. So there's something that when the opposites are too far apart, our psyche can't really abide that. And so that tends to, at least this myth shows that there tends to be a healing dynamic that's initiated. And the healing dynamic that gets initiated when this opposites are too far apart is called a symptom. So, for example, sometimes, we know people who may never be angry. And I don't know, sometimes in New Age movements, you see people who, or meet people who are very focused on spiritual, and they may say, well, I never get angry. It's, that's good. I only want to surround myself with white light. That's all the dark stuff. Oftentimes, so the dark side is too split off. It's unconscious, and they're living out only in a one-sided pure way. If they're lucky, they may start to fall into a depression, or they may find themselves getting anxious, or they may find themselves not being able to handle a relationship. They may say they actually don't want a relationship, but they may, I don't know, maybe they get physically ill because oftentimes, let's say they go on a particularly austere nutritional program and they fall ill. You know, something, if they're lucky, will happen to them, and that will initiate a healing dynamic. Um, you know, similarly, you know, oftentimes, you know, you could see somebody with a sexual addiction, let's say, and maybe they're kind of identified with, well, so here's where you see it. So oftentimes, you can, you know, I worked with a lot of men in my practice, and I worked with a lot of gay men over the years, and uh, but this isn't only with gay men, this is with men, it can be women in general. But sometimes where you see like a sexual addiction, or in the guise of a spiritual attitude towards sex, um, oftentimes you can see people who both are focused on a kind of spirituality where the instinctual aspect, let's say in the form of sexuality, has a more Mahishi-like quality. And so, um, and so there's this split between their kind of conscious spiritual aspect, and sometimes they could have a sort of pseudo spiritual aspect towards spirituality or towards sexuality that would, let's say, that would be without relatedness. And so they may have difficulty kind of forming a deep uh, enduring romantic relationship with somebody because the sexual and the spiritual are split. The thing about Ayyappan is, you know, Ayyappan was a 12-year-old boy. So Ayyappan represents this puer aeternus, the eternal youth. He's the child. And the child is an image of the self that has to do with futurity and imagination and play and hope and something new developing in the psyche. That's sort of the positive aspects. The negative aspect of the child or this kind of this youth, the poor, can be a difficulty with commitment, a difficulty forming deep relationship, a kind of childishness or a kind of um, uh, um, you know, a kind of overly focus on self. So sometimes, oftentimes you can see people with this split as being very childish or adolescent. And so that they can seem very spiritual, but there's kind of an adolescent relating to the spirituality, or a kind of adolescent way of living out sexuality where you don't bring the two together. Um, you know what? Why don't I stop there, and see if there are any questions?
Sure, let's, so people please use the raise hand function to indicate that you have a question or might want to make a comment. Always takes a while to get going.
All right. Well, let me just say, see, it's this, I with Ayyappan and with Mahishi and or with Leela and Datta, Ayyappa is kind of a reconciling symbol in a way that the three that Ayyappa is of Shiva and Vishnu, and Leela is still the three goddesses. What's missing from the two of them is Brahma, the creative god. And so when the pilgrims go to the temple and worship Ayyappan, they kind of represent Brahma. They bring the embodied creative aspect to the god. And so the three through the pilgrimage are in essence coming together again. There are implications for what that means psychologically, which I can explain, or I'm happy to, do this at another time, to continue. But
Oh, we're not getting any raised hands yet.
okay.
It's a lot to take. Oh, there's one. Michael Whitney, unmute yourself and then go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. This has been extremely interesting. As a little bit of a background, I'm the producer of the film Matter of Heart and was there doing von Franz several times. And what comes to my mind is that I heard all the time about Answer to Job during the production of the film Matter of Heart. The Jungians were talking about matter of Answer to Job over and over again. And the sense that I finally have makes me feel it weaves into the discussion you had tonight in terms of Datta and Lila. By the way, my granddaughter Lila is sitting here at 9.5 years old today. But it makes me think of Datta and Lila in terms of in Answer to Job. I understood on the level of Yahweh and Hasatan, or the angel and Hasatan, in an early period of God, Yahweh, where he's still in formation, and the two of these pressuring him, especially Hasatan as the advocate, to say, you need to push on Job. And the feeling that I had from the book is that Yahweh finally became jealous that Job had more presence than he had, more consciousness than Yahweh was existing. And that seems to me to be very eloquently tied into the Hindu things of these cycles where it comes out in different positions. And it makes me feel I've never heard anything so clear in terms of Datta and Lila in the process that you've been describing.
Yes. Yeah, no, exactly. Because in a way, see, Datta cursed Leela. Datta had to curse Leela because Leela, as she was an inappropriate symbol for carrying all that libido. And so she was transformed into a buffalo. So in our dreams, in our dream images actually transform into the images transform as our kind of psychic, emotional, mental, archetypal energy shifts. The images carry the kind of energy. And so Datta had to curse Leela, and he had to curse Leela so that this whole process could be brought into live life. If Datta didn't curse Leela, everything would have remained unconscious, and it would all be going on. It would all be going on unconsciously. Stuff would be happening below the level of consciousness. Nothing like a symptom or crisis would erupt into live life, and that's what's necessary.
But it makes sense to, pardon me for interrupting.
Yeah.
It seems that Hasatan put God, Yahweh, in the position that he had to emerge, because that's what Jung talks about. It's the inner psychology, the reality of the psychology revision, that it made God, Yahweh, God, need to come out as Christ. That's the linkage that we get into Christianity, and the separation of exodus of Hasatan as a needed part of it is critical and a shortcoming in that sense.
Yeah. Right. And see, there's in this is a paper I published, people can read it, but there was Ayyappan also was a divine child like Jesus was. Ayyappan isn't actually complete. Ayyappan came to earth, you could say, in the way that Jesus did, in order to solve a problem, but it's actually the human participation that brings the solution to the problem, and that it isn't the God, but the gods somehow forced the problem into the realm of lived experience. And what that would look like in life is, so by sending Mahishi to Earth, the gods did this. It would mean that that there's an eruption of some kind of psychic force into consciousness, it would have to do with symptom formation or some kind of acting out. That there's this, because see, if there's something's askew or awry in our psyches and it's not brought to earth, we don't really know about it. We don't really experience it. And there could be some kind of problem going on that really is going to ruin our lives. And unless, we see this all the time, sometimes you see people who are really screwed up in life and they have no idea. There's not enough disruption. Or you see people where the problems exist outside of them. It's never them. Maybe if they're lucky, maybe it creates difficulty in their life because other people's problems make their lives more difficult. And so they come into analysis. Well, that offers a start. Maybe there's an opening there.
So there's a question for the Hindus. In that pilgrimage, do they go through this Jungian process of needing to individuate themselves?
I think the pilgrimage is part of that process. Because in going through the process, so people on the pilgrimage, and by the way, women of menstruating age are not allowed on the pilgrimage. Again, in that you see a fear of the instinctual. The reason for that is that it was thought that wild animals may attack the pilgrims if they smelled menstrual blood. Or that the male adherents may get too excited. So even in there, there's a fear of the instinctual, there's a fear of the feminine, there's an over or focus on the spiritual. But, and this is important, that that oftentimes a lot of the pilgrims, the devotees, pray to the God for a better job, or pray to the God for more money, or pray to the God to find a partner, or for better health. So it's interesting, it's a spiritual pursuit that's used to bring about kind of more earthly potency. So where Brahma represents the creative and the earthly creation, Ayyappan is really only Shiva and Vishnu, destruction and sustenance, that the pilgrims kind of represent this missing Brahma, and yet they're going to the spiritual to have more embodied potency. But by participating in the pilgrimage, that in an embodied way, they may actually be embodying this creative potency. They may actually bring that to the God.
What strikes me from the Jung film, from Matter of Heart, is the wheat field dream of Jung, talking about the young woman who's been in therapy, and she's bringing back her transference. And his comment, I think, is right to the point you're just making. He says, I want the acorn to emerge into an oak, not a donkey.
Yes. By the way, for anybody who hasn't seen Matter of Heart, it is such a moving, powerful documentary on Jung that I think was done in the 80s.
In the 80s, we were working from the 70s to the 80s. It came out in 85.
Before I became an analyst, I was in another profession, and I didn't know of Jung, and I was in the financial world, and a colleague of mine handed me a video, and he said, "Oh, watch this," and it was Matter of Heart, and I
I'm a
was,
financial advisor.
oh, well, that's it worked, and I was in my early 20s at the time, and I thought, "What's this?" So, wow,
I'm in my 70s and I'm a financial advisor. So
we did a reverse.
Synchronicity.
Yeah, so does anybody, Michael, we could go on for days, but does
There
anybody else?
was another person with her hand up,
Okay,
and Lynn, I'm not sure if she.
It's Lynn, and I'm here. I unmuted and then my hand was put down. So please excuse me that I'm just being bold enough to just intervene. But I truly appreciated this really excellent reminding is what I will call it. But it's the story goes on, and
yeah,
this understanding that I liked so well about this heavy the carrying of the libido. I think that's a really extraordinary expression that you were putting in as something that actually it leans in the direction of something that is a burden, perhaps, about paying attention to the body a lot more. And in so many ways, especially in our American present situation, the somehow dismissing of the harmony that needs to be made is where those who have been following this pathway of pilgrimage have something to offer, and it can be joyful, because the joyful pilgrim is part of what we're called to be. I'm one who's done a lot of working with understanding mythology in different cultures as well. And if I may also bring it personally, introducing to me the aspect of how do we pull through the myths of the three diversities of religious faiths, I shall say it that way. I happen to belong to all of them, if I can say it that way. That sense of, where does this story go on? It has to do a lot, as you were saying, with how do you interpret the symbols as images. I'm so glad you spoke about that. But it also has to do with not demeaning that quality that says, in the Conference of Birds, it says in one of the stories, when the servant has understood what is the desire of his heart and the longing of his soul, he will again be able to have that love relationship which is equal.
That's beautiful. Right. Right. And I love what you said about joyful pilgrims. May we all be joyful pilgrims.
Yes.
What more could we want? Yeah, no, exactly. And see, the thing is that when Mahishi is a buffalo, um, so just in general, the further in dreams and let's say in dreams, the further, and this may be kind of a non sequitur, but the more different something is than us, the further away it is from consciousness.
Mhm.
So the reason why Jung called the anima and animus, said that they were the contra-sexual aspect of our psyche, and the reason why shadow is typically same sex, while anima, animus is, let's say, frequently opposite sex, is because um, the other sex image-wise, is more different than us than the shadow is.
Mhm.
Now, I think we have to be careful not to be too concrete about that because in terms of different gendered experiences and expressions and different sexual identities, that you look at the function, something may be imaged um, similarly, but be more different than something that's like you may dream have if you're a man, you may have a male anima, let's say, and that may carry more difference than, let's say, a particular woman in your dream. So I think we have to look at the function of what somebody carries. But when we move to animals, we get further away from anything that can be assimilated into consciousness. Like, it's interesting because now I supervise people, and there's some young patients of some of my supervisees who will claim multiple identities, some of them animals. And you can't know what if you talk about a buffalo, we can know from a human perspective qualities of buffalo, but we can't know buffalo-ness. We can't know the consciousness or an experience of being a buffalo. But so in the myth, where Mahishi was a buffalo, and acting that out, right? The sexuality was too only, it didn't, it was too instinctual. And you have to look at specifically what buffalo is. Buffaloes are powerful, they're powerful animals, and they're necessary, and so they represent kind of powerful instinct. The problem is when they run rampage, when they cause havoc. So that would be like if you have sexual potency, by the way, it can be any kind of instinctual behavior, not just sex, but any kind of acting out on instinct. When it's too dissociated and too animalistic and wreaking havoc, that's a problem. Hunger, right? If you're ravenous, if you eat like a I don't know, what's an animal that eats a lot? Um,
Pigs.
Pigs eat a lot. If you kind of get ravenous all the time and you eat all right, like let's say you take an animal that destroys all the vegetation around it, it just keeps going and going. That's a kind of hunger that harms psychic functioning. And so when Mahishi got transformed back and Leela was released, it's because there was a cycle that would represent a psychological process that wrestles with this urge. So, if in the case of a kind of sex, and you're kind of acting out sexually all over the place and it's uncontrolled or uncontained, if you can bring a kind of real wrestling with it, real work on it, real coming head to head with it, And maybe you go to then you go to a 12-step program to help bring the spiritual aspect into the urge. That's then when Leela, who was actually called Malika Prathama, but that's a whole other thing, emerges, then that's the possible, there's a transformation in that. So yeah.
We
Thank
have
you.
one, I'm gonna we have one more raised hand, so let's maybe
Okay.
just.
Can
go
I
ahead.
just say one other thing?
Sure.
Also, the term for demons in Hinduism, there are Rakshasas, and those are kind of these monster demons. The more kind of major ones are called asuras. And asura, which is the demon, has its roots. It's the root of the word is God in sacred and holy. For instance, in Zoroastrianism, there was a god Ahura Mazda, and that was the highest god. Ahura um, is a root of or along the way, which became Asura. So even the demons in Hinduism have a hint of telos in them, that the demons are in league with the gods. And so these are our complexes that are kind of in league with our better natures, and all are necessary. That there's a kind of purity to our complexes, and that they're necessary. They're not bad. Other kind of schools of thought sees complexes as bad and something that needs to be resolved. We have to kind of live them out and have them be transformed so that the antique soul of divinity can be expressed through them.
Wow, that's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Mitra Makbula, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. My question is, what does it mean when you have a dream of Ganesh without having ever seen the character, heard about it, but it is Ganesh? You later find out what it is, but it comes to you from your unconscious. What would that mean for the person when you have that dream?
Well, that's interesting. And if it is Ganesha, not just an elephant, let's say, um,
Definitely Ganesha, yeah.
okay. And without knowing the dream, so I'm just going to speak generally because I don't want to say without knowing the dream or how the image shows up that this means that, because then I get into then I become like a symbol dictionary, and that's like reading the horoscope in the newspaper and thinking
Of course, let me give
yeah.
you just a hint of,
But without telling
yeah,
you the dream, I can just say
okay.
in general, so your psyche, even though consciously, the image of Ganesha, you could say, is a projection of a kind of the Hindu psyche or humanity, um, sort of the kind of collective psyche generated this image or projected or kind of created this image in a way that it resonated with enough of the collective in order to become a religious figure. In other words, there are certain images that are collective that just seem to catch on because they represent that they are a good image for holding the kind of psychic energy that it points to, the kind of meaning of it. And so you would look at the meaning of Ganesha and try to read about Ganesha and look at some myths about Ganesha in order to understand what your psyche is kind of talking about in that image. I'll say something personally. My partner's from India, and when we first met, I had the image of an elephant charging me, which I later understood to be Ganesha, and I kind of stood there and had to withstand it, and it passed through me. And I brought that into my own analysis at the time, And I realized, what we realized is that I had to withstand the force of this relationship that was hitting me out of the blue like an elephant charging me. And I had to be able to kind of withstand that. And then you know, years and years and years later, you know, I have, and it's still in it. So, and it still hits me, you know.
Thank you. I have another question, but we are over time, so I don't want to take your time. Thank you so much.
Judy, I'm happy to continue for a few more minutes. I don't know what you would like.
Well, there are no other hand raised. And Mitra do you want to ask your other question, Mitra?
Yeah, that would be lovely if I could do that. As far as the symbolism of Arjuna and Krishna, you mentioned that it's the Dharma and that we are supposed to carry out the Dharma regardless of the morality and immorality involved. Wouldn't that get us in trouble? Because all these mass murderers, they claim that God spoke to them, told them to do this, to do that. I'm wondering if it might not be perhaps less dangerous if we just look at it as the archetype of the higher self talking to the awakening ego and saying you must kill anything in your past, things that you are very attached to them. You must kill them all, even though it feels very, very difficult and maddening, sometimes saddening. We need to do it. Now, again, I always compare the Arjuna-Krishna myth and this massacre that has to happen to what we have in the Old Testament, where a lot of people say, well, Jehovah or Yahweh is a very bloody God, because he says you must kill the 7 nations. And we know from archaeology these 7 nations didn't even exist at the time, and you're supposed to eliminate even their animals and their children, this and that. And so it's a similar situation. The 7 deadly sins, you're supposed to get rid of them, uproot them from your being. I don't know what you think about this idea of the interpretation of the symbolic interpretation of Arjuna and Krishna, instead of saying that if God says something to you, it's your duty or dharma, you got to do it. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that we don't get to decide what our dharma is, but we're not talking about, it takes a lot of discernment and a difficult amount of work to really understand what one's dharma is. You know, that you could say that we, you know, I sometimes look at things as workable myths. So if we talk about reincarnation, which is part of Hinduism and Buddhism, you know, the thought would be that we're born into Earth, we're born here in order to kind of work out our karma. And so we need to be an embodied form in order to get to the place where we have no more karma. Now, karma is the stuff you carry with you based on past actions in earlier lives. So if you kill somebody, you know, you have karma. You have bad, you know, you have karma. If the thing about Hinduism, though, is if you look at the, you know, the scripture, is that it's not that you're supposed to have a balance of good karma. You know, there's good karma and bad karma. You're supposed to have no karma. So if you think that we're born into this life to deal with particular things in our lives, for me, when I say workable myth, I can use the concept of reincarnation as a way not to compare myself to other people. Because I can look at somebody else and say, wow, they have such a great life. Why do they get to have this? I wish I had that. You know, look at their relationship or look at their, you know, the riches or their job or whatever. I don't know what they're born here to work out. But you could say that we're born here, that through living out our dharma, living out our own sort of duty, finding our own way, you know, like the Tao, finding our own way through life, living out our own destiny. Um, um, we don't know what that is, and it isn't necessarily going to match kind of conventional collective mores. And so if somebody said, you know, God tells me to murder people, and so I'm going to be a mass murderer, I would bet you that's not actually the person's Dharma. And that the person may see themselves as a God. And so they may be identifying with Krishna or another God, Yama, the god of death. They may be identifying with the god of death. But that's likely not their Dharma. And you're right. You know, individuation is dangerous. If one lives according to a collective path and one does
Yes.
everything that one's supposed to do and lives in a pure and good way, that is good for everybody in life, except it kills off your spirit. And
Right.
probably the people around you can't stand you because nobody can stand somebody who's too pure.
Yes.
So yeah, we
Thank you.
don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know which way life's going to take us. In sin, you know, you can look at sin symbolically as perhaps sin is failure to respond to the image in the way that the image is meant to be responded to. You could say sin is a way of failing to read the image. So if, let's say, God tells you to kill people, well, yeah, maybe you need to kill people, but that may be something symbolic and internal, not something external.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
That was very interesting indeed. Well, I think that's it. And thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I apologize if this was kind of disjointed. I realize I got through maybe 10%. I'm always too ambitious and over prepare, and I got through probably about 10% of it. So I hope that everybody found that helpful. And also, you know, I'm happy to, you know, if people want to write me after and have questions, you know, feel free to email me.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
Okay, well, so that will be it. We will say goodbye and hope to see everybody next month with our Ukrainian analyst. That should be really so much.
Can I add one thing?
Sure, please.
I leave. Judy, I'm so sorry that you're continuing to be sick. I continue to be kind of spellbound and awed by what you do and what you've done, you and the other members of the club. You know, initially when there was psychological club in Zurich and there were, you know, analytical psychology clubs are, you know, all over the world, and I don't understand, you know, how this cannot be the epitome of what that is meant to be. So
Thank you.
I just wanted to applaud you as well.
Thank you. Thank you
Yes.
so much.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
I was going to say something and now I don't remember what it was. Oh, I know. So this is the second time that I have hosted a lecture while I have COVID. And the first time the speaker's name was also Michael. So not sure what that means.
What you're darn what the teleology is.
Right, right. So I'm going to be very wary the next time I have another Michael.
Mhm. It's a good
Okay,
omen.
So Whitney, be careful.
hope to see you all in February and take care of yourself, those of you in LA, please. The winds are supposedly coming back next week.
Oh
So
yeah, yeah.
Pray.
concerning. Okay,
Yeah.
bye
Sure.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
God bless.